It's 8:02, and now it's time for the Moral Maze with Michael Burke.
Good evening. The public needed reassurance this week, and Downing Street did its best. Tony Blair, his spokesman, said not only thinks genetically modified food is a good thing, but he actually eats it himself. The public promptly went and hid itself under the stairs. After BSE and countless other shambolically mishandled issues of this kind, a politician saying food is safe has the whole nation worried. Should we be? First, some background. GM foods have had their genetic blueprints altered for pleasure, productivity or profit, typically to be more resistant to pests or to herbicides, to grow larger, stay fresh longer, have more nutritious properties. It's more precise than cross-breeding, which we've been doing for centuries and is really blind juggling with hundreds of genes, but more radical because biotechnology now transplants genes from totally foreign species, fish into tomatoes apparently. Few products have been approved here yet, but they're very pervasive. GM soya from America, particularly, which is in 60% of our processed food, from chocolate biscuits to Chinese meals. Genetic modification, it was said this week, could be the greatest gift that science has to offer the 21st century. But opposition is broadly based, far beyond the usual overwrought tree huggers and marginalised scientists. There are real worries that artificial genetic combinations may damage us and our immune systems, that new characteristics may spread, creating superweeds, killing wildlife, that the technology is in the hands of powerful corporations that can influence politicians and thus the regulatory framework in which they operate. A snappy slogan too, Frankenstein Foods. There's a scientific argument already underway, a political argument about regulation, identification and choice, but a deeper moral question too. How far is it right for man to play God and manipulate nature? That's our Moral Maze, live tonight. Our regular panel, Janet Daley of The Telegraph, Dr. David Cook, the medical ethicist from Oxford, the constitutional historian, Dr. David Starkey, and Professor Ian Hargreaves, commentator, teacher and journalist. Ian.
Well, I think we can forget the playing God argument. If human beings had declined to improve on their natural circumstances, my children would be at risk of death from diphtheria, and David Starkey would be wearing a bone through his nose. I'm not sure which would be more alarming. But there are vital moral issues here that are not that. The biggest is our responsibility to future generations not to take unnecessary risks with the environment. So far, the food and farming industries have simply not made the case that the potential benefits on offer match, let alone exceed, the risks. We should slow down and we should think harder.
Janet Daley?
Well, I don't think we can dismiss the playing God arguments at all, and I don't think we should be too patronising about public fears. People have a sense that there is something qualitatively different about the manipulation of genetic material from the other kinds of interference with nature, which science and technology has always done. Genes are the stuff of life forms themselves, the basis of what makes a living thing what it is. There's a Faustian quality about transgenic experimentation, a sense that we're not simply trying to alter the conditions with which life presents us, but the very nature of being alive. To fear that there could be irreversible or catastrophic consequences to this isn't just superstition, it shows a quite appropriate sense of awe and moral sensitivity.
David Starkey.
I likewise agree that the argument about playing God on the whole is rather silly, and my general view of things would incline me to be rather favourable towards GM foods. On the other hand, if I had tried hard to present a worse case with a bigger smell of corruption, of business involvement, of excessive ties between the academics, the scientists, these civil servants and the business people who make, judge and profit from it, I couldn't have done a better job. It stinks, and that's not because of biodiversity.
David Cook.
Well, the trouble with playing God is that God's omniscient and we're not. For example, if we talk about 60% of products have got genetic modification, that's not quite true. It doesn't mean that 60% of any one product is genetically modified. In fact, the soya bean only has one gene which is genetically modified and 50,000 others. When you turn it into flour, it degrades. There is a risk, but life is a riskful activity. The problem is vested interests, whether it's the biotech companies, environmentalist lobby, the media and even politics. And the other problem is that we, the public, don't really understand science. We don't really understand risk. We need to know truth we can rely on. We need to be able to choose. That means effective labelling and very effective regulation.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Julian Rose, who's an organic farmer, has been for the last 25 years, and a council member of the Soil Association, and broadly speaking opposed to genetically modified food. Is that opposition on sentimental, scientific or moral grounds?
Well, certainly moral, and I think scientific. I don't think sentimental. I've been involved in farming organically too long. I've got over the sentimental side of it. I think basically what we feel is we're crossing barriers which have never been crossed before. I heard it said, actually, just before I came in, that it was a more precise art than normal crossbreeding. But actually, genes only crossbreed within closely related families normally. So artificial genes are randomly spliced into DNA, disrupts that family organization, and you get unpredictable outcomes. And I would have thought that was most obvious to most members of the public, that if you take a gene out of a cod and put it into a tomato, you've crossed barriers which you never attempted to do before.
And that's your scientific objection. Your moral objection?
Well,
in a sentence,
yes.
if I may ask you, invite you?
The moral objection is that, as someone has already said about playing God, I think we are tampering with the very genetic pool from which we come. And I think we are playing with powers that we don't understand. And I don't think really human beings are wise enough, or well-established enough on this planet, you might even say, to dare to enter this field.
Ian Hargreaves.
As an organic farmer, and I sympathise with organic farmers, you are opposed not only to genetic modification, you're opposed to the use of pesticides and the use of fertilisers. Is that a moral position?
Well, I'm not against the use of fertilizers. What I would actually say is that we use fertilizers, and intensive farming uses something called synthetic nitrogen, which actually isn't a fertilizer at all. It simply pushes plants.
But do you regard that position as a moral position?
Not really. I think it's the best way to grow healthy food and make sure that we have a fertile soil for future generations. It's actually a very pragmatic position.
So your moral position about this subject does go entirely to the genetic, to the playing God argument.
I have to say that I don't think this is the first thing that I would say is a moral issue when it comes to agriculture. I think we've got a moral issue at stake when we talk about factory farming as a whole. When you talk about cows being pushed to produce 30 litres of milk a day when their natural production might be 12 to 15. When you're talking about embryo transfers, when you're talking about cloning, etc. I mean, this is all in that particular area. It's just that we appear to have crossed yet another boundary, and probably far too quickly.
But what do you say to those who say that what you do, organic farming, will be helped by genetic modification because it will allow less use of some of the things that you spend your life campaigning against?
Well, I have very little truck with that, actually. I think what they're talking about is, for instance, trying to fix wheat so that it in turn fixes nitrogen, whereas clovers and beans do that quite naturally. We incorporate them into rotations. The nitrogen from them makes our wheat grow properly. We just don't need it. It's unnecessary.
David Starkey.
I'm going to preface it with exactly the same remark that you got from him. I'm terribly sympathetic, but supposing I weren't, I would say that I've just heard sentimental claptrap. And hanging on the wall of every farming museum are these wonderful pictures of 18th century pigs with their the ancestors of the Tamworth pigs, aren't they? With their distended bellies and their little feet trotting along. We've been doing this forever. You're simply sentimentally defending a particular point in the historical farming process, aren't you?
Well, we've certainly been breeding cattle forever, and we've bred some pretty strange-looking ones. But we have been breeding within family types. We haven't tried to cross over into completely separate family types. And incidentally, the argument has always been it's to feed the nation. Now the argument is it's to feed the world. Can we feed the world on organic farming, or do we have to genetically modify things in order to feed the world?
You haven't mentioned landscape.
Well,
surely the key issue, as far as we're concerned, is that hyper-efficient farming is leading to a deserted, abandoned landscape.
Indeed.
Whereas?
Well, you can't get a more hyper-efficient form of farming, supposedly, than genetic modification. This is seen by the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food to be the most efficient form you could ever take farming to. So actually, unfortunately, you've got a product which wipes out, for instance, in the case of herbicides, which plants being made resistant to herbicides, soya and maize, so that you can apply twice as much herbicide than you normally would, which actually annihilates the insect population and therefore the biodiversity of those fields, and you get a collapse of that pyramid of biodiversity.
What would the ideal landscape for a Monsanto-type agriculture look like?
Well, I think it would be rather like a lot of American cities look like. It would be the grid system, with very little else growing apart from a super plant crop.
David Cook?
Well, this sounds like an aesthetic argument. I want to go back to your moral argument about tampering with nature. I want to know whether or not you think it's proper to take aspirin, whether or not
Yes,
somebody who's got diabetes, it's
Very
proper
much so.
for them to take insulin.
Yes, I do.
And that's not tampering with nature?
Well, what I believe is that we've got remarkable cures. We've got antibiotics, and we've got insulin, we've got all sorts of extraordinarily important things. And incidentally, they are used in organic farming. We will inject our cows with an antibiotic if she can't be saved by anything else.
So you're not against biotechnology in itself, then?
If that's the word if that's the way you're describing biotechnology,
Well, I want to go a
wouldn't, but I don't
stage
think-
further,
I don't think that is the normal
I want to go a
description
stage
of
further
biotechnology.
because we've identified genes which cause muscular dystrophy. If we could manipulate that gene and save children from suffering, do you think that's tampering with nature?
Well, I tell you what, I do think it is worth slightly separating.
Well, do
the
you
issues
think
of
it's
food
tampering with
production
nature?
and the possible medical benefits?
Well, your issue was tampering with nature, whether or not actually changing the material itself is fundamentally wrong. That was the moral position.
I think what we have to say here is I think you have a point, and I don't deny you have a point here, but I think if it's being very carefully controlled on a very small scale, even the moral argument is slightly different.
So it's the scale, it's not the actual principle itself. You've given me the principle, which is under certain circumstances, if it's for human benefit, then we can modify genes.
Well, no, I'm not prepared, I'm afraid. I know you're going to try and ease me into that particular corner, but I'm going to resist it rather strongly.
Well, I'm back to my muscular
actually, I don't-
dystrophy child and whether or not you're actually going to modify the gene to help the child or not.
Well, no, I think in this particular case, I'd rather go to prevention.
There
is better
isn't a
than
way of
cure.
preventing this.
But there
is the
may
only way
well
we can
be.
do it.
There
There
are
isn't,
other
though.
means of approaching these things. I
There
don't think it's
isn't.
the only one.
Janet Daley?
But are you saying that you'd accept genetic manipulation if it was preventative? Because there are such things. There's embryo research going on which is intended to prevent birth defects before birth. Are you saying that you'd accept genetic manipulation at that stage?
And I don't think I would, really. You know, I tell you what I'm against here. I'm against science getting caught up in very, very fine points, almost cul-de-sacs, in very, very particular aspects of medicine, and making that a sort of excuse for branching out into all other fields.
But on the
you don't
contrary-
feel that it's possible then to extrapolate. What David Cook is trying to get you to do is saying because you're prepared to accept certain instances, it's necessary for you to accept the generalisation that it always must be acceptable.
Actually, well, I haven't quite said that I'm prepared to accept it, but I'm prepared to consider them, and I think there is a difference between those two things.
David Cook, do you
Well,
want to...
I'm just
one
interested,
very quick question.
Just whether or not actual genetic modification in the end can be avoided, and whether or not we would in fact think it was acceptable if there was a clear benefit.
Well, I think the point is that there's plenty of information which I've seen which says if you're talking about how to feed people, and if you're talking about how to feed the world, that the argument is actually wrong. We should be talking about how the world can feed itself.
So it's a practical argument, not a moral one.
Well, it is a question of how the world can feed itself and how people, for instance, in the third world and other parts of the world can re-explore their own indigenous materials, which are much cheaper and less high-technically fixed. And that's probably all they can ultimately afford at the end of the day as well.
Jean and Rose, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Next witness is Professor Janet Bainbridge, who's chairman of the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes, and joins us now on the line from Radio Cleveland.
Good evening.
Good evening, hi. Professor Bainbridge, do we have the moral right to tamper with nature in this way? Is it, let me ask you a more basic question, is it in your view in any way a moral issue?
I think there are moral issues that have been raised this evening. Many of those issues are extrapolating from the use of genetic modification to improve our food supply. I think if you were to ask the question, does anyone have any right to tamper with nature, you simply need to ask the question, what do we do about 90% of medical intervention? I would very much like to keep my contribution very much focused on the issue of genetic modification and related to food. But if you're going to extrapolate, is it wrong to look at genetics to look for a cure for cystic fibrosis or haemophilia, very serious, well-known genetic diseases?
It's a telling point.
What I would say, and where I come from, is as a regulator, it's my duty to walk a tightrope, as it were, between political influences on one side and commercial influences on the other, and simply look at the science and come to the best decision along with my committee members, who incidentally include a consumer advisor and an ethicist. And the overriding consideration must always be consumer safety. We must never deviate from that.
I understand that. Hang on a second before you lay out your entire wares. David Starkey wants to intervene.
I understand, Professor Bainbridge, that you are the chairman, or whatever the word is, of the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes.
That's absolutely right, yes.
Your predecessor, Professor Derek Burke, said, we've been using the word vested interest. I was not allowed to have any contact with any food company, nor accept any money from them, and I never did. Could you repeat that remark?
Yes, and it also applies to me. That I was never allowed to have any contact with any food company. I never received or not allowed to have any money from them, and I never did.
Have you, in your previous research, have you or your department ever accepted any such money?
No, we haven't, not from the food industry. I run a very, very large faculty, which includes a lot of science, a lot of engineering.
So when we say, forgive me, when we say food industry, would that also apply to biogenetic industry of any sort?
Absolutely, yes.
Good, very good. So you obviously regard that, as you've been insistent on that, as being very important. Would you then be a little worried by the fact that the chairman of the main research council in this area, I understand the Biotechnology and Biological Science Research Council, is himself an executive of Zeneca?
The chairman of the Biological BBSRC,
Indeed.
the Research Council, is not directly connected in any way, shape or form to the ACNFP, so obviously I can't comment on...
No,
on
but
what
sorry,
might or
forgive
might not
me,
be his interest.
this is a research council, is it not, which is responsible, I mean, supposing research has to be done on the safety of these products, this would well be one of the research councils to which people would go, wouldn't they?
No. When a company wants to submit an application to actually obtain a consent to market one of these products, they, within the rules of
forgive
the
me,
Novel Food
forgive me,
Regulation, they actually submit the
Professor
information to the
Bainbridge, you
committee.
misunderstand.
It's nothing to do with the BBSRC.
Sorry, can you try and listen to questions first and answer them second? The question was, if an academic wants funding to research into the safety of one of these products, the BBSRC would be a body that they would go to, would it not?
Sorry, I'm not hearing very clearly. Could you repeat that question? I must get this question right to give you an accurate answer.
Repeat the question, please, David, and then I think we ought to move on.
I was pointing out to you that if an academic wanted to test the safety of one of these genetically engineered foods, the BBSRC would be precisely a body that they could go to for funding, wouldn't it?
It would be one of the bodies, but there would be other sources of funding as well.
Thank you, David. Janet Daley.
Can we pursue this aspect of the relationship between company interests, financial interests, and genetic research? Because it's something that concerns a great many people. Can you explain, as briefly as possible, to us and to the audience, what a terminator gene is?
A terminator gene, yes, a terminator gene is a gene that's added to the genome of a plant so that effectively the pollen the plant is no longer self-fertile.
Yes, in other words,
So
it doesn't produce
it
it doesn't
like a
produce.
hybrid plant.
Sorry, can I just? It doesn't. Just to put it in layman's terms, it doesn't seed itself. It doesn't produce what agriculture has always depended on in the past, which is its own
put
seed.
it in the terms that a layman would understand, gardeners know that if they buy a seed that's an F1 hybrid, they can't save the seed.
Right.
Because
So
it wouldn't grow true to
agricultural...
form. If there's a terminator gene present, then the plant would not produce viable pollen or not produce viable
exactly.
seeds.
So in other words, what farmers have always traditionally depended on, which is that a crop would be able to seed itself, would no longer be the case with terminator gene plants. Now, what I'm suggesting, if you just let me put a question to you, what I'm suggesting is that would make the world agrarian industry, if you like, world agriculture, completely dependent on seed suppliers, seed manufacturers. They would not be able to seed their own crops.
Yes, I understand the question. If all agricultural crops had terminator genes, that would be true. Many farmers do save seeds, but not for generation upon generation. And also, there are a lot of arguments coming out now about issues relating to cross-fertilisation of genetically modified crops and not. I'm not for 1 minute saying that I would support terminator technology in any shape or form, but certainly those arguments are all refuted if you actually use terminator technology. So as in many of these issues, there are pros and cons, and it's the job of the scientists to balance those issues and give the best scientific advice they can. Independence, and I repeat, independence of any commercial interests.
I understand, David Cook?
Can I ask you as a scientist then to give some advice? Because one of the cries that we've heard in the last week is for a moratorium on this kind of work. What scientific advice can you give us?
The scientific advice that I would give is I do not support a moratorium. And perhaps I can just explain why. There are actually several reasons for this. One is that we couldn't impose a moratorium outside of our own territorial shores, as it were. And this technology, as the food chain, is global. That's one issue. The other issue is I have every confidence in the robustness of the current regulatory system, and I don't think there's any more that can be done in that context.
So on the
where there are particular issues, and there are issues, and there are some concerns, as you know, they've been highlighted in the recent House of Lords report, and they've been aired very much in the press over this past week, about effects on biodiversity and things. Very carefully controlled experiments
Professor Bainbridge, can I just say to you this? Professor Bainbridge, sorry,
can I just do the work to get the results? The final argument I would put is, if you have a moratorium, how long is it going to be? How long are you going to hold up the process of science? What would be the switch that said, right, we've had a moratorium, now will we return to technology? Because it's just not realistic to say this technology should be switched off forever. You've got to think about all those issues before you actually say, yes, I would support a moratorium.
Professor Bainbridge, I'm going to have to declare a moratorium there, there on the contribution from Cleveland. Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Our next witness is George Monbiot, who's an environmental campaigner and visiting professor of environmental science at the University of East London. What, to your mind, and you just heard Professor Bainbridge, what to your mind are the dangers we're facing, and how real, how quantifiable are they?
I think the principal danger is a political and economic one, that we're seeing a small number of very large corporations already with a great deal of power, which extends in some places to what you could call regulatory capture, who are able to grab hold of a significant portion of the food chain.
And when Professor Bainbridge describes a robust regulatory framework, I think she used the word robust, do you think she's overstating the case?
I think, unfortunately, it's about as far from robust as it could possibly be. We're seeing in the United States this fantastic revolving door developing between Monsanto in particular and the Food and Drug Administration, where the same staff just go round and round, between the Oval Office and Monsanto. We've seen Monsanto giving lots of soft money to the 1996 presidential Clinton campaign.
Can we come to England?
And here in England, we've already seen Bill Clinton phoning up Tony Blair to say, you've got to do this or there's going to be a trade war, you've got to allow these guys to go. And we see the Invest in Britain Bureau, which advertises Britain to foreign investors, boasting that we have the most friendly regulatory regime in Europe, and we go further than any other European country to allow biotech companies to prosper.
Let's just look at the actual evidence here, because the publicity for this didn't begin with looking at Clinton and kind of that sort, but rather it looked at one particular set of experiments. And these particular set of experiments were very interesting, because now that the information has been released, it's quite clear that the guy mixed up the samples, that there was in fact an audit which said these results are not reliable, and the so-called experts, the 22 experts, of whom there were only 3 Brits, were animal pathologists. None of them had any experience in terms of crop development, or in terms of genetic manipulation, or in terms of plant development. So much for the experts.
I think, David, with some respect, you've mixed up the samples a bit. We saw an internal audit was done, which was then challenged by a second audit conducted by pathologists at the University of Aberdeen and people from elsewhere, and their results have not yet been published and cannot yet be analysed. They have not gone to peer review.
The audit we have thus far does cast doubt, then?
The audit we have thus far does cast doubt, but doubt has then been cast on that audit itself. It's a very confused situation indeed, and the problem is, and the real problem here, is that Dr. Pushtai, who did the original work, was subjected to a gagging order. The original work was not allowed out into the public domain, and so we haven't been able to make clear, objective assessments.
And the experts?
The experts are completely divided. I know some of the foremost geneticists in the world, Professor Martha Crouch, Professor Joe Cummings, some very good British ones, for instance, such as Dr. Michael Antonio, Dr. Ricardo Steinbrecher, who are absolutely adamant that there are some real serious questions and problems here which haven't been addressed. Science is unquestionably split on this issue.
Ian Hargreaves?
I'd like to come away from the political and economic arguments, although they are powerful, but we've explored them. What is the moral issue here, or do you not really think there is a moral issue?
I do believe that the moral issue is contained within the political and economic arguments. For example, and this is about the most straightforward moral issue that you could possibly have, at the moment, the world produces enough food for at least 6.4 billion people, even on current consumption patterns, and yet there are hundreds of millions of people way below adequate nutrition levels. There are millions of people who actually starve to death every year. Now that happens because the food is in the wrong hands. The food and the land on which it is grown are in the wrong hands. What this technology enables to happen is the rich and powerful corporations, in this case, to take over even more of the food and even more in the land on which it's grown, and that will ensure that this maldistribution of food is exacerbated.
If we go back, though, to a previous generation of agricultural technology, would you not have made a very similar argument and have denied to the kinds of developing countries that you're talking about the benefits of that particular green revolution?
There are some technologies which have expanded small farmer participation, for example, and the impact on local markets, positive impact on local markets, and there are some which have restricted it. There's no question that some aspects of the green revolution were actually damaging in terms of the distribution of food.
But would you be in favour of this technology if you could be satisfied that it would help small farmers in Asia and Africa?
I think there would have to be three criteria which I'd have to see answered. The one is a human health one, and the jury's out on that. We simply don't know about it. The second one is the ecological impacts. There's no question that there are some serious ecological impacts here, and these are demonstrable. We can already show what is happening in terms of the amount of weeds, the amount of other biodiversity within a field, for example. And the third is this corporate control. I don't see at the moment how these three issues can be disentangled from the current biotech economy, especially in view of the fact that we have a worldwide patenting regime now being enforced by the World Trade Organization. Basically, you get the biotech, you get the patents and the ownership with it.
Can I simplify this argument? What do you say to those people who are just watching this whole argument going on, and this whole some people have described as hysteria that seems to have leapt out from nowhere, not through any particular development over the last week, and who say, well, hang on a second, nobody's been killed by this stuff. There is an obvious advantage to be gained if tomatoes don't go mildewed on the shelves after 3 days. Nobody's been killed by it. This is all being got up by various newspapers for political reasons, various journalists like yourselves for their own, as a hobby horse that's riding and swinging pretty free, and it's all a row over absolutely nothing.
Well, on the human health aspect, we simply don't know, and there's some pathologists I've been talking to recently.
What you're saying, it is possible that people are being damaged and killed by genetically modified food, and we don't know about it.
It might be happening, it might not be happening.
Well, I mean, there might be an asteroid heading for the Earth as well that's going to wipe us all out, but that's not...
The pathologists, Michael, I've been talking to over the last couple of weeks say there's a serious problem here. They believe, these pathologists I've been speaking to, that the process used by the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes is both too short and doesn't require sufficient evidence to enable them to decide whether or not they're regulating these things properly. Now, the critical issue here is that they use a principle called substantial equivalence. A GM potato is substantially equivalent to an ordinary potato. And in food terms, they're probably right. But what some of these pathologists argue is that in medical terms, they might be very far away.
It's not a drug. I just want to go back to the third world argument, because the problem is greed and selfishness. And I don't know how controlling genetic modification is going to make any difference to the greed and selfishness of the first world against the two-thirds world.
Well, let's talk about greed and selfishness, because it's this very technology which has enabled greed and selfishness to take off and become extremely effective. for the big biotech companies who are able to harness these things, patent these genes, and ensure that no one else can get a look in. Now, say you're a small
call for
farmer.
regulation, but Janet is...
Talking about getting a look in. Can Janet have a quick
greed
question?
and selfishness. Greed and selfishness. Isn't the argument for third world starvation got much more to do with corruption and bad politics in developing countries? In fact, the first world, the European world, has been phenomenally generous in attempting to give food aid and money aid to the third world, and most of it gets soaked up by corrupt governments in developing countries.
Unfortunately, a lot of the structural way in which the food aid and the food aid has been organised has actually undermined a lot of self-reliance and a lot of not because of necessarily what the third world countries are doing, but because of dumping from the first world countries. Now, there is a quote, and I've spoken about this before in this programme, actually, and it's a very clear position. One of the authors of the US Farm Act said, if we do not prevent these countries from achieving self-reliance now, our worldwide competitive position will continue to erode. That's the agenda behind this, and that's currently driving the new biotech revolution.
George Monbiot, 2 programmes in one. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot. Our last witness is Matt Ridley, who's currently writing a book called Genome, which will be published later this year. Matt Ridley, what do you think? We've heard a lot about what we stand to lose or might lose, or what theoretically might disadvantage us from genetically modified food. What do you think we have to gain in all this? We don't seem to have heard very much of that.
Well, I think that is the problem with the debate, is that we don't tend to hear about the benefits, and that's partly because we don't yet know for sure which are coming, and they're very diffuse benefits. But the development of genetic technologies, I see it as part of a general technological innovation in agriculture, which started particularly with the Green Revolution 30 years ago or so, when we saw all sorts of technologies, not just fertilizers, but particularly a lot of plant breeding. And what it did was it improved the lot of not just farmers, but consumers all over the world. It enabled us to feed 6 billion people, which we thought we couldn't do 30 years ago. The next stage in this revolution is probably to move to genetic technologies. And I believe it's quite possible that these genetic technologies will enable us to solve some of the problems that came with the last phase. In other words, to wean ourselves off some of the chemical inputs that go into modern-day farming. Now, I may be wrong, and the alarmists may be right that that dream will never be realized, but it seems to me the debate at the moment is not allowing that possibility even to be considered.
But as an advantage for an ordinary member of the public worrying about all this debate and worrying about the weight of fear that seems to surround it, to get a handle on something that it might, an advantage, the advantage you're saying, or the principal advantage might be we need to use less synthetic nitrogen-fixing fertilizers.
And if you put it in national terms, we need to be able to remain competitive agriculturally, economically. This technology is coming. A lot of it was invented in this country. Indeed, a very long time ago, a lot of these technologies began to be developed. It was the early 80s when this stuff was being done, a lot of it in Britain. And it's been planted in America and other parts of the world for 3 years now, and there simply isn't a smoking gun of danger. They had a very thorough debate in America, they regulate themselves very carefully, and on the whole, we're being reassured. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't go on worrying, but it does mean that so far, so good.
Janet Daley.
Even assuming that all these developments may prove harmless, what's the rush? Why not have a few more years to see what the long-term consequences or the longer-term consequences might be? Why is there such a rush to get these products onto the market, to get people consuming these products? Why not have a temporary halt?
But I don't think there has been that much of a rush. I mean, I concede your point that, that we should take this very, very slowly and carefully. And to some extent, I think I agree with you. If we're that much more worried in this country for good historical reasons to do with BSE, then maybe we should be allowed longer time to consider it and to watch whether people die in other countries, if you like.
American lives don't count as much as ours.
We don't want to confuse immediate health risks to ourselves or even our children, the next generation, with a much longer-term risk to the environment. They're two separate kinds of risk that we have to think about.
Yes, they are, and they should be kept very separate. And some of my predecessors in this seat have I think, made that clear. And I agree with that. I think the human health risks, I personally think the human health risks, I find it very hard to imagine what they could be from a properly regulated industry of this kind.
But then we always find it difficult to imagine, don't we? If someone had said 15 years ago, you mustn't feed animal remains to herbivore cows or they'll go mad, it would have sounded like superstitious rubbish, wouldn't it?
Yes, I agree. I grant that point, but I think that there are so many other technologies which we worried about, and it turned out the worries were unfounded. That, things were all right.
David Starkey?
Yesterday morning on Today, the government's chief scientist said that, continuing the subject of BSC, the decision to continue the ban on beef on bone had been taken essentially on political grounds. Isn't this the trouble? There's absolutely no one we can trust on this.
I think that's right, and I think it's very interesting.
So there is no one we can trust.
Sorry?
There is nobody we can trust.
David is struck dumb.
Yourself.
No, hang on a second. David is struck dumb by somebody agreeing with him.
No, I mean, I think what I agree with is that the British perceive that there's no one that they can trust. And to some extent, I think they're right to do so. I think it's very healthy now that we don't trust the first thing that the experts throw at us. In America, it's true that after a very full public debate and a lot of media coverage and so on, they in the end have gone quiet because they think the FDA has done a good job of regulating this stuff.
So all the stuff we
over
have...
here, we don't trust anything, the equivalent of the FDA because of BSE.
So all the stuff that we heard from your predecessor in that chair, Professor Monbiot, about the connections between Monsanto and the Federal Food and Drugs Agency and Clinton, it's just pie in the sky, cheap journalistic rubbish, is it? He's just inventing it.
No,
this cheap professor's just inventing it, is he?
No, I didn't say that. And it's true that there are vested interests that one has to watch out for very carefully on that side of the argument, but there are on the other too. I mean, one hasn't to forget that environmentalists have a huge vested interest in drumming up the scare. So do journalists, because they are alarmism sells is what gets them onto the front
Janet
page.
Daley put a very simple question to you. She asked you, what is the possible advantage, bearing in mind now that our problem is an agricultural landscape which is being deserted, industrially produced food that is tasteless. I put it to you, the last thing we want is yet more industrially generated food in this country. Isn't that true?
Not necessarily at all. I would make the counter-argument that industrially generated food, if you call it that, has enabled us to increase productivity so much on some land that we can afford to set other land aside for nature. If we were farming organically, we'd need a third as much again of the land converted to agriculture. That would leave no room for
Sorry, David. Ian Hargreaves.
I'm struck by the caution of your language about the possible benefits that you may be wrong about, you say, of genetically modified plants and food. Would you use equally cautious language about the expectable benefits of human genetic engineering?
No, I don't think I would, and I think that's an interesting point, because I think it's partly because the introduction of genes into plants is still, I think, the jury's still out on the extent to which it's really going to change the technology of plant growing. It's true also of human beings, but the downside of it failing in human beings could be less.
Isn't that crucial, though, because the benefits on the plant side are so vague? Why should we take any risk at all?
I don't think it's because they're vague. I think they are potentially huge ones, but I think one should open one's mind to the possibility that they may not materialize. And I think, that's perfectly right. I don't see anything wrong with staying in the middle of the debate and saying, let's weigh the pros and cons, as you heard Professor Bainbridge saying. Why must we polarize it? Why must we say it's definitely going to be good at this stage or it's definitely going to be bad at this stage? It's too early to tell.
Matt Ridley, thanks very much indeed. Panel, what do we make of the evidence? You had a bit of a tussle with Professor Bainbridge, David Starkey, when she talked about having to walk a tightrope between political influences and commercial influences, yet nonetheless the regulatory framework was robust. The Starkey sneer was in evidence.
The Starkey sneer was justifiably in evidence. It wasn't only the Starkey sneer, it was a Professor Monbiot sneer. The list of cross-connections on both sides of the Atlantic is overwhelming, and for reasons of libel, we've only begun to list the names. The list goes on and on. But what I thought was most interesting was actually what Matt Ridley was saying, and many of the things that he didn't say at the end. The benefits are very difficult to perceive. it seems to me at the moment that what we clearly want is more food that actually tastes good and is enjoyable. The problem of feeding the masses is solved. It's done with. If you actually look at the genetically modified foods which are available now, they're rubbish foods for the... Just one second. They're rubbish foods for the masses. They're soya to inject into all kind of nameless pre-processed foods. They're cheap tomatoes to put in squirty tubes that come out from Sainsbury's.
Well,
it's not real food.
David, I could listen to you all night.
You may not
You usually do,
may
Mike.
have to. Ian Hargreaves.
You may not want to cook with it yourself, David, but that's really not the point. I mean, the point is, if this technology offered us a realistic approach to dealing with serious famine, undernutrition in huge tracts of the world, I would be arguing to do it. The problem is that nobody is coming close to being confident that that's so. So why should we take the risk?
Janet Daley?
No technology could solve those problems because those problems are basically political and economic. They're to do with corrupt and wasteful and deliberately sort of malign third world governments. Those problems, we are already overproducing food in the West. We pay farmers not to produce food because we're so overproducing it. The problem is distribution, the problem is economic, the problem is political. Technology can only cure, as Matt Ridley implied, the problems that technology of a previous generation created.
Yes, all right, if you're looking at those blunt terms, but what if you could produce a particular crop, the wood crop, in particularly marginal situations that you might get in some parts of Africa, and people could actually sustain themselves? I mean, there is a more complicated argument.
But there would be
a
political difficulty in them sustaining themselves, not just a technological difficulty.
Okay, David Cook, your point about manipulating human genes in order to dispose of cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy and all this sort of stuff seem to bring the opponents of GM foods up with a halt.
Well, it did rather, because we've had some model arguments. First of all, that people were playing God, but they were happy to play God if it saved human life. We had arguments about risk to human safety, but in the end they said the jury was out. Then we had moratorium. Well, there was no evidence that we should have a moratorium, because how then are we going to gather the information that's going to tell us one way or the other? The problem was the two-thirds world, and whether or not that actually made any difference. And in the season of Lent, I think it's the first world that needs to give up eating a little bit rather than trying to...
Forgive me, David, I
make
thought...
profits.
I thought David Cook's point about genetic manipulation to save human beings from disease was a complete red herring in this case.
Because you wanted to generalise it.
We're talking about genetic manipulation of plants for food, and the question is, are there clear benefits to justify the risks? There are clearly benefits to curing a child of cystic fibrosis.
But Janet, you wanted to make a different argument. You wanted to begin by saying that this is a Faustian pact and therefore must be avoided. But you are not in reality. None of the people in this debate are actually prepared to avoid it as a matter of first moral principle if the benefits are great enough. That is the way we read the moral argument, and that's the proper way to read the moral argument.
Well, I've never seen the like. Exactly. All not arguing at all, sitting nodding at each other in great compliance. That's it for this week. From our panel, Janet Daley, David Cook, David Starkey, Ian Hargreaves, off now to share a genetically modified rissole in the Moral Maze Brasserie du Choix while I hit the road to Birmingham, home of the Archers and a shrine to organic wholesomeness, as we all know. Until next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Burke and produced by David Coombs.